common thing I hear from aspiring videographers and filmmakers is I don't have a camera. But if there's one thing I know, it's that the best camera is the one that we already have. And what do we all have? A cell phone! I apologize in advance, this video is geared towards iPhone users. I could not work my way around an Android if my life depended on it. But today I'm going to share 5 iPhone videography hacks. Technology has come a long way, and although I don't agree that phones can already replace DSLR cameras, I do think they're capable of producing exceptional quality, especially when it comes to the right lighting conditions. One of my favorite iPhone features is that it's able to shoot 4K 60. So to enable 4K 60 on your phone, you want to first go into settings. From settings, you want to scroll down until you see camera. Click on camera and then you'll see record video. Once you see record video, you'll see a whole list of options that you'll have. If you're not familiar with this, you might look at it and be a little bit confused because they're kind of throwing a lot of numbers at us. The first number tends to be the resolution, and I'm gonna put it up on the screen as to what each resolution is, but the resolution essentially is the number of pixels that make up an image. As you get higher up on the number of pixels, you're gonna have a higher pixel density, and what that means is you're gonna have a sharper image, and sharper images are generally going to be able to carry more detail. Another benefit of shooting in a higher resolution that I take advantage of all the time is if you did not have time to properly compose your shot, when you're editing, you're able to zoom in a little bit and reframe without losing significant quality, just because you have the extra pixels that are making up that extra detail for you. On the other hand, you also have the second number that is followed by FPS, which means frames per second, because a video is essentially that. A video is made up of multiple images or frames that are playing consecutively to give you a moving picture. In other words, motion picture. What that means is if you're shooting in a higher frames per second, so 60 frames per second for example, you're going to have a smoother image naturally. On top of that, because 24 frames per second is the cinematic standard and 30 frames per second is the TV standard, if you're shooting in 60 frames per second, you will have the ability to slow down your footage, because if in 1 second for TV you have 30 frames and you're shooting in 60 frames, what you're shooting in that 1 second can be stretched out into 2 seconds. You know what I'm trying to say? Speaking of slowing down your footage, that actually takes me to hack number 2, which is the fact that iPhones can actually shoot super slow-mo. And although you can't do this in 4K, you can do this in 1080p, and you can use this effect in a lot of creative ways. So the way that you can access this is, again, you're gonna go back into settings, you can go down to the camera again, and right under record video where we just were, it says record slow-mo. And here you have the option to shoot in 120 frames per second or 240 frames per second. So the higher number of frames they're gonna be, you are able to slow down the image even more. One of my absolute favorite things about shooting slow motion on the iPhone is the fact that you can actually go back to the footage and adjust exactly when you want the slow motion to kick in. So if I show you this clip here of me and my boy Jeff playing in the snow, I can click edit here and you can see right under the timeline you have this slider, and that's exactly where the slow motion is going to kick in. So if I put the slow motion here, you can play it back, that is where the image is going to slow down. Now it's going really, really slow because it's 240 frames. If I move it back to where I originally had it, when I press slow motion, it's gonna slow right there and it's gonna speed up right where that other line ends. The third iPhone videography hack I have for you guys is cinematic mode. And hear me out, it's not just cinematic mode, because I used to be the biggest hater of cinematic mode on iPhones because I felt like the background blur was so unnatural. But what I've really grown to love about the cinematic mode on the iPhone is 2 things. Once you take a video, you can press edit and you can actually change the focus points that you have. You also are able to change your f-stop when you're in cinematic mode, which I wasn't really aware of until recently. Now, for those of you who aren't really familiar with what f-stop is basically aperture, and aperture is one of the settings that are responsible for how much light hits the sensor of a camera. The relationship with light is this: if you have a lower f-stop or lower aperture, you're gonna be able to let in more light into the camera. And if you have a higher f-stop, you're gonna have less light hitting the camera. The thing is, because iPhones adjust exposure for us automatically, you're not typically going to see these exposure changes when you change the f-stop. But what aperture and f-stop are also responsible for is background blur in an image. And so if you have a lower f-stop, you're typically gonna see more background blur. When you have a higher f-stop, you're gonna see less background blur. Now, one of my favorite things about cinematic mode that I briefly mentioned earlier is the ability to change your focus points after you've already taken a video. That for me is very powerful, because sometimes you're filming something and it's out of focus and you can't go back and change it. But with cinematic mode, now you can, which is kind of crazy. And I think the reason for that is because the background blur in cinematic mode is computer generated, it's not natural. My biggest critique of cinematic mode also ends up being like one of its biggest strengths. But because it's computer generated, you're able to adjust where you want it to be focused as long as those points are actually showing up. If you're shooting a video in cinematic mode, sometimes you're gonna have the yellow box that shows you what's in focus, and then another gray box that shows you what could be in focus. And if you find that you want to switch it up after the fact, you can always press edit. You can change the focus points at a specific point, and what you're gonna see in the timeline below the actual image timeline is you're gonna see little keyframes or little points that set those values for you and allow you to have a clean focus rack after you've saved the video. iPhone videography hack number 4 is going to be exposure compensation, where changing your aperture isn't typically going to change the brightness of your image very much on your iPhone because of the automatic exposure. If you want to ever override that, the exposure compensation button is going to be for you. This feature can be very beneficial when you're trying to film in an environment that is unevenly lit. So for example, if you're trying to film a landscape and the sky is very bright that day, chances are if your phone is trying to focus on the sky, you're gonna make everything else in the image very dark because it needs to make the sky, look properly exposed. And so you can go and press the exposure compensation button. You can increase by however many stops of light, and it's going to compensate for that instead. So the shadow parts that are too dark are going to be lit a little bit better, and the sky's gonna be a little bit brighter too, but at least you'll see what it is that you want to show. One of my favorite things about the newer iPhones is that you have dedicated lenses for specific zooms. And this is going to be iPhone hack number 5, using different lenses on your phone. Typically, I think most of us will use the zoom on our iPhone in order to film something that is either smaller or very, very far away. But I think it's very beneficial for us to have the 0.5, 1, 2, even 3 times zooms, because it gives us the opportunity to share different perspectives of whatever it is that we're filming. I'm not sure if you guys have noticed in the past, but when we film with a wide lens, it tends to give an immersive experience because we're able to see more of the surroundings. Another thing that wide lenses also do is that it tends to push the background farther into the background. If you're on wide mode, you're gonna make the whole scene look huge and larger than life, basically. Meanwhile, if you're shooting in 3 times zoom, typically it's going to be a little more focused on whatever that subject is, and it's actually going to compress the image in a way that makes the background look much closer to the subject or the foreground. And all in all, this is just multiple different perspectives. What I personally noticed is that when you use different focal lengths, your video tends to be more dynamic because it looks like it has a lot more different perspectives, and sharing these different perspectives ultimately helps to make your video more engaging to your audience. Alright everyone, so those are the 5 iPhone videography hacks I have for you today. We have filming in 4K 60, we have filming in slow-mo 120 or 240 frames per second, we have filming in cinematic mode and the features and functions that make it very unique in my opinion. We have exposure compensation, and we also have filming with different lenses. I hope if you used the reasoning of I don't have a camera in the past, that you now have the confidence, or I could maybe instill some confidence in you to use your phone to try to create whatever vision you have in mind. Because as you see, as technology has gotten better, we are more and more equipped, I feel like, to use our phones in ways that'll help us bring our visions to life. So if any of you draw inspiration from this video and decide to create something with your phones, please tag me in it. I would love to see it. And if you feel like you gained value from this video, make sure to like the video. If you have any questions for me, leave it in the comments below. And if you want to learn more in the future and join in on the journey, then please subscribe, and I will see you guys soon. Peace.